The origin of our laws in chapter 15, section 1 is that throughout history, civilizations have developed systems of laws to meet basic needs. And so some terms: common law, that is law that applies to all people; statute, that's just the formal term for a rule; and precedent, that is, once we see something done one way, it might make sense to continue to do it that way. And so our first question is, should judges consider precedent to an equal standing as the law when it comes to making decisions? Because right now there are two bases for law: precedent and statute. That is, the way we have done things traditionally and what is codified legally in writing. And so laws are really just a set of rules that allow people in a society to live together. And they exist for a purely rational reason, because the reality is that if we are going to coexist with one another, we need a few ground rules to make that practical. You know, if you want to be a hermit and live in the woods, you can do whatever you want. Chase animals, howl at the moon, wear nothing but bark. I don't know, whatever it is you do by yourself living in the woods, you go do that. Be absolutely free. Because that's the only way you're going to be absolutely free, is to live in isolation. Now, if you're going to live in the company of others, in community, in society, well, then we have agreed as a people there are certain things that need to be done. And again, that's the rational basis in our world. So what does law do? What is the function? Number one, it defines what is and what is not permissible. You know, what is permissible? You choose your own clothing. What is not? You must wear clothing. We've agreed on that as a society. Secondly, we have to understand that not everyone is going to want to obey all the rules all of the time. And so this requires an entire system of enforcement and interpretation. Ergo, punishments. Because while many of us may agree that wearing clothes is a good thing, some nuts occasionally going to do something silly and need a consequence as a result. And then finally, this has to be handled in an appropriate way. And that does require considerable resources. You know, administration of justice through law enforcement agencies and the courts. That is the job of law enforcement, to make sure that the laws are enforced. And when they formally accuse someone of a crime, that is to make an arrest, there is a whole nother department that has the job of making sure that the accused is protected according to their rights in the Constitution. And then finally, not everything is a crime. You know, when two of you have a disagreement and go meet with our counselor, that doesn't mean that you have automatically committed a crime. You might have a disagreement, and you might be at an impasse, unable to settle that disagreement. And there needs to be a formal process for that. Because while you may be meeting with the counselor over a personal issue related to some drama with your friend that can hopefully be worked out, sometimes things can't be worked out. And sometimes that involves property or custody or lots of complicating factors. And so again, that's where the law comes in. What makes a law good? Because not all laws are good. Number one, it needs to be fair to everyone. Fair to everyone. Consequences need to be reasonable. Consequences need to be reasonable. You know, execution is not a reasonable consequence for theft, no matter how much you may be upset about the property that was stolen from you. Death is not a fair or reasonable consequence. And then, very importantly, law needs to be simple. If we expect people to obey this law, it needs to be understood. It needs to be able to be understood. Clearly posted, well communicated, and enforceable. Meaning, for a law to work, it must be enforceable. For example, prohibition was based on some very understandable feelings. You know, it was generally pushed for by groups like the Women's Christian Temperance Union, who saw a connection between alcohol and domestic violence and abuse in families. And so they wanted to limit or to prohibit the drinking of alcohol altogether. The problem with that was the enforcement. It was just impossible to stop people from drinking alcohol. Ergo, the law failed. Next, how do you determine whether or not a law is fair? It's a tricky situation. It's a difficult question, and that is honestly the job of the court system and the police in our country. Bottom line, a lot of resources are expended trying to answer that very question. Okay, so history of law. Here's the brief, simple version. You know, early societies have had a very profound and important impact on the laws that we use and follow today. Here are some of the earliest laws. Originally, humans existed as hunter-gatherers. We traveled around the world from place to place, generally moving with the seasons, migrating with the animals that we lived on, and hunting and gathering food as necessary to survive. The global human population was very small, and most people were on the move and lived very short and difficult lives. It wasn't until about 10,000 BCE that communities began to settle and agriculture began to emerge. And it was at that time, around 10,000 BCE, that law began to emerge. Because when people began to dwell together in community, then civilization became more complex. Now, we can assume that laws existed as an oral tradition much further back, even during the nomadic era. But we know that the earliest written laws came about at a certain time. So the earliest of written law is the Code of Hammurabi. And I was wrong on my timeline. It's actually much older. It dates back to about 1760 BCE. And it is one of the oldest written sets of laws in our history. It's not the oldest law. We can assume that oral tradition placed ground rules on various communities dating way back when. You know, when Og the caveman killed his neighbor, I'm sure there was a consequence. But all of that was very informal. This is the first codified set. And you can actually go and see the original Hammurabi's Code. I think it's at the British Museum. The Ten Commandments are certainly a very ancient set of laws. They date back to about 360 BCE. Again, they were written by Jewish scribes in captivity in Babylon. And the reason I chose these three, and your book chose these three as well, is that each of these have had a profound effect on the American legal system today. For example, the first code of Roman law, called the 12 Tables, was the first set of laws to prescribe equal treatment under the law for all Roman citizens. For example, when the Apostle Paul was arrested for preaching Christianity around the Roman Empire, he was allowed, because he was a Roman citizen, he was allowed to stand trial. Equal protection under the law. Now, a little more of the history. Alexander the Great was one of the first conquerors to expose Greek culture to the ancient world. In fact, he connected a lot of different cultures through conquest. But not long after Alexander the Great would emerge the Romans. Starting with Augustus, when Rome became an empire, their influence spread around the ancient Mediterranean world. So this brought Roman law, once more called the 12 Tables, to Africa, because the empire controlled the northern part of Africa, to Europe, because most of Western Europe was being administered by the Roman Empire, and even to parts of Asia. In world history, you learn how the Roman Empire eventually collapsed. The Western Empire was invaded and conquered by a group called the Ostrogoths. The Eastern Empire survived for another 1,000 years, but were eventually conquered by a group called the Ottoman Turks. And so there's no longer a Rome except for the city called Rome. But Roman law and culture were preserved. In fact, even after the Western Empire had fallen, even after the Ostrogoths had invaded and destroyed the city of Rome 7 times, the Eastern Empire continued to flourish. And one of the most famous emperors of the Eastern Empire, called the Byzantines, was a man named Justinian. And Justinian's code became the basis for law in the Byzantine Empire. In fact, the Byzantines were a group of Eastern Orthodox Christians. The Eastern Orthodox split with the Catholics during a time called the Great Schism, and essentially they formed their own religious denomination. And their laws were largely based off of these old Roman laws. Now, when Napoleon tried to conquer the world in the 1700s, and did quite a good job, in fact, he conquered all of Western Europe, nearly Russia, much of the Mediterranean world, and had essentially, for a short period of time, rebuilt the Roman Empire. And then he revised these laws. He didn't redo them. He didn't throw them away, because much of what was written in the 12 Tables, all the way back from the beginnings of the Roman Republic, made sense and still continued to make sense. And so Napoleon updated them and called it the Napoleonic Code, because he liked himself an awful lot, so he named his set of laws after himself. Well, anyway, this became the, quote, modern system of law. The Napoleonic Code set up some of the first public schools. It set up the very first system of the rights of the accused. That is, that you're assumed innocent until proven guilty. In a lot of ways, Napoleon modernized law and improved things quite a bit. Well, the English in the 1600s were also undergoing a bit of a transition. It was called the Glorious Revolution. King Charles wanted all the power. But the English people were really sick of one king having all of the power. And they wanted that king to be accountable to the people. And so they forced the king to sign a document called the Magna Carta. And it became the basis for English common law. So common law is a system of law based on precedent and customs and statutes, but the important fact to know is that it applies equally to everyone, regardless of race, gender, creed, national origin, socioeconomic status, etc. The point is that law is meant to be applied equally. And so English common law is the most important source for understanding American law. And so the idea that laws should be applied equally dates back even much further. 600 years prior, William the Conqueror was the last successful person to conquer the island of England. In 1066, in a battle called Hastings, and it's an amazing story I don't want to get into for time's sake, William the Conqueror became the last person to conquer England. And as a result, a lot of these French ideas incorporated into a lot of these English customs, and that's the beginning of common law. But once more, precedents are rulings that are used as the basis of later judicial systems. So if we decide that you are not supposed to wear hats, I'll pick the dumbest thing I could. So if we decided that you weren't supposed to wear hats, then next we have to figure out how to handle that. So if a hat gets you execution, well, that's pretty harsh, right? So we're going to figure this out, but it's going to take some doing. So the appropriate consequence for wearing a hat when you're not supposed to might be something like detention. Okay. And we see after a while that detention is an effective deterrent for wearing hats without being excessive. It works. No one wears hats. No one wants detention. Yay. Okay. We have established a precedent that detention is an effective consequence to deter the wearing of hats. Okay. So next, English common law once more incorporates Roman law, church law. Again, it's based on this idea that every individual has rights. And of course now, while you can read and understand the Constitution in a day, if you want to read and understand all statutes of American law, you need to go to law school, and you need to take one of the most difficult standardized tests in our country called the bar exam to become a certified lawyer. Meaning you will need to be able to understand and recall a lot of statutes. Well, statutes are written laws by the legislative branch in our government. So that is all laws that Congress has written. And not even lawyers know all of them, because there are libraries full of statutes. So this idea, once more, was codified, it was formalized during the Glorious Revolution, and then at that same time a lot of English settlers were coming over to the United States, and so we set up a very similar system. All right, so the question once more is, should legal systems be based on common law? Are they more fair than systems that are based primarily on legal code? And once more, that's what the experts do.